kind invitation. It's a real honor and privilege to be here in person in this wonderful university and, of course, a wonderful city. In the next 50 minutes or so before the book prize, I am going to talk about translanguaging as a pedagogy for inclusion and social justice. Ever since the publication of the book that you mentioned with Ophélie Garcia, Translanguaging, Language, Bilingualism and Education in 2014, which did win the Book Prize in 2015, I've been asked to talk about translanguaging quite a lot on many occasions in different parts of the world. I must say, I thought we've tried very hard to make our arguments clear, and there shouldn't be any confusion or misunderstanding of the concept anymore. Of course, as I said in a recent paper, Translanguaging as Method, there are people who wish the concept was never invented, but we can't actually take credit for it because none of the people who's actively pursuing the idea of translanguaging actually invented it. I'll come back to that later. And there are also people who wish it would just go away and we all go back to the good old days when languages are regarded as abstract codes, and what bilinguals and multilinguals do is simply mixing them up or switching between them. Now, the concept of translanguaging has clearly disrupted all of that. It's very hard to imagine, at least for me, that in this day and age, with our ever-increasing dependency on digital and modal communication technologies and new media, many people would still regard languages as codes in the conventional sense, and what we do on a daily basis in multi- and transmodal communication is simply code switching. But I'm not going to get into any terminological debate here. When the abstract of my talk today was put on the conference website, where I said translanguaging is often taken or mistaken as a teaching strategy, I did get quite a few reactions from people. You know, people think, oh, is it not a teaching strategy? I've been trying hard to use it for teaching. And there is, of course, the term pedagogical translanguaging, which has gained some currency, a lot of currency indeed. First of all, I have no problem with the term pedagogical translanguaging. In fact, our friends, Yasoni Chenos and Dirk Gorter, wrote a very nice introductory book with that very title in our sister-brother series that Professor Heath Rose of Oxford and my colleague Jim McKinley are expertly editing for Cambridge. Their series is Cambridge Elements in Language Teaching, and the one that Zhuhua and I are editing is Cambridge Elements in Applied Linguistics. They're equally fantastic, of course. In the talks and seminars and workshops or public engagement events that I've been doing in different parts of the world, I do get asked very often very practical questions, such as, I teach a linguistically, socially diverse group of students. I want to encourage them to use their first language or first languages in the classroom, as the principles of translanguaging seem to be suggesting. But other pupils in the same class, and myself as a teacher, don't know these languages. It doesn't appear to be a particularly effective or efficient way of teaching with all the time and resource constraints. And of course, the school language policy does not necessarily encourage the use of multiple languages. Another group of teachers who are very keen not to be missed out and want to use translanguaging as a pedagogical practice is the modern foreign language teachers. They know that the role of L1 in L2 learning has been debated in SLA for decades, and they accept the principle that L2 learning can be more effective if the learners, L1s, are made more positive use of, hence the idea of positive transfer. But again, I'm a class teacher. I have 40, 50 minutes at a session at a secondary level, maybe a bit longer at a tertiary level. I need to get through the syllabus. I've got a lot to cover, and I've got a target to achieve. I can't possibly allow all the languages that my students know to be exercised, to be used in class, or compare the intricate details between their first languages and the target language. And crucially, I need to get them over a specific threshold in the target language that I'm teaching so that they can pass the exams and get the grades they need. Just like teaching English as an additional language students, EAL students, they need to be over a particular threshold in English in order to learn and communicate in class. Now, these are genuine questions, real concerns by our professional colleagues and indeed many of us ourselves. So I'm going to address these concerns by revisiting very briefly the origins of the concept of translanguaging and the theoretical assumptions that underpin the practices, whether it's pedagogical practice or as an everyday social practice. I'm going to then focus on translanguaging as a pedagogical practice, especially for inclusion and social justice, which is the theme of this conference, or at least part of the theme, and explore the foundational requirements for pedagogical translanguaging. There I'm going to invoke the concept of co-learning, which I believe is crucial in translanguaging for inclusion and social justice. And I'll return to the legitimate practical concerns that I've just outlined with an alternative framing of the issues that we as language teachers and researchers need to deal with. So, first, a very brief outline of the development of the concept of translanguaging, or the idea of translanguaging. I'm sure most of you here know already that the idea of translanguaging originated in the Welsh revitalization programs, where the medium of instruction was supposedly Welsh, and the content of the teaching wasn't really language per se, but other subject matters. It's important to remind ourselves that there is no Welsh monolingual in the community. The pupils and the teachers in these Welsh medium schools and classes are bilingual in Welsh and in English. And many, especially the pupils, feel more proficient and comfortable in English. Ken Williams, an experienced teacher and teacher trainer who was doing a doctorate at University of Bangor, observed a commonly occurring classroom situation where the teacher would give instructions and ask questions in Welsh, as the school policy expected, but the bilingual pupils would respond quite naturally in English. Occasionally, they might read something in English and discuss it in Welsh. So listening, speaking, reading, and writing were done alternatively in either Welsh or English, and sometimes in a mixture of the two. This is not what the school wanted to happen. To revive a language, the assumption is very often to insist on using the target language only, without switching to or mixing with anything else, and to maximize both input and output in the target language. But Ken Williams had a different view and made a different argument. Rather than seeing this alternating between the two languages, especially responding to questions in the pupils' responding to questions in the pupil's preferred language, English, as a problem or barrier to learning, he viewed it as a way of maximizing the bilingual potential in learning. So this was an agentive learner strategy to start with, by the learners rather than the teachers. What Ken Williams was suggesting or arguing for was to respect the fact that the pupils were bilingual, not monolingual. And they lived in a bilingual environment, and that's very important. That was the bottom line, as it were, respecting the pupil as who they are. And that was the basis for the idea of translanguaging, which Ken Williams referred to with this Welsh word, which I won't try to pronounce. just to complete the story of the origin of the concept, it was Ken Williams' doctoral supervisor, Colin Baker, who introduced the idea to the English-speaking world in an earlier version of his famous textbook, Foundations of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, the second edition, a bit over 20 years ago. Initially, he used the term translinguifying, but later on changed to translanguaging by adding trans to the long-established concept of languaging. That's why I said earlier that those of us who are actively pursuing the idea of translanguaging didn't invent it ourselves, but Ken Williams and Colin Baker did. But the most important point here is that it was a learner strategy, rather than a teacher strategy, out of their natural instinct, as bilinguals would do. The question then is, and that's exactly the question that Ken Williams actually wanted to address. Should teaching be aimed at encouraging and facilitating positive, in the sense of productive and beneficial, use of what comes naturally to the learner, or imposing some other behavioral norms on them? It's a genuine question, actually, because the classroom, whether it's a language classroom or some other content classroom, is a specific socially constructed space, often divorced from the everyday social and community realities of the learners and, indeed, the teachers, too. Homeschooling during COVID reminded us of that very vividly. And let's face it, not everybody in the world have the privilege of having access to what we in the global north understand as the classroom. To what extent should we try to bring a bit of the social and sociolinguistic realities of the community in which our learners live into the classroom is a question of inclusion and social justice to me. I don't have time to go through the entire history of the development of the concept of translanguaging here. There are many key milestones and landmark works by colleagues such as Ophelia Garcia that's been mentioned in the United States, with a specific reference to the education of minoritized and racialized bilingual learners with a decolonizing education, equality and social justice agenda. And of course in the UK, Angela Crease, Adrian Blackledge and many others led major research projects on translanguaging, not only in various educational contexts, including complementary schools for ethnic minority pupils, but also in the community and for everyday social context. Caroline Tag is here and Zhu Hua is here, and they've been involved in many such projects. And there are many other applications of the concept to a variety of fields, such as visual arts, music, gender studies, etc. And there is a great deal of discussion of translanguaging creativity and the linguistic and semiotic innovations multilinguals produce through translanguaging, which is the other part of the conference theme, innovation. But I don't have time to address that today. I've written a couple of papers, or a few papers, asking the question whether the translingual expressions multilingual learners produce should be regarded as learner errors or translanguaging innovation and creativity. What seems to be clear is that the very term translanguaging has caught the imagination of people from very different disciplinary background with a diverse research and professional interest. That itself has led to some confusion and misunderstanding, which is inevitable. At the same time, the concept of translanguaging has raised some fundamental issues, really important questions about language, about bilingualism, and about education, as the subtitle of our book says. I've tried to address them in various publications. I want to just pick two theoretical arguments and comment on them very briefly before I move on to the main part of the discussion on pedagogy. The first point I want to talk about, actually just let me go back a bit. The first point I want to talk about briefly is the nature of language. And the key argument here is that language as we commonly know it is a meaning potential. And what we do when we use linguistic codes is to make meaning and make sense of each other in everyday interaction. And that is known as languaging, which should be the focus of linguistic research. And this is not actually my idea as such. It's a point that was made very clearly by Michael Halliday in the 1980s, in fact, and before that, when he was in my current institution. The languages with names and labels, as we know them, are abstractions from this social activity of languaging. And it is the linguist who socially constructed languages and gave them names and labels, including categorizing them, some of them as dialect and others as languages, and indeed some as standard and others as a vernacular, with very serious social consequences. And this is the second point I want to raise here, and that is bilinguals and multilinguals do not think in a named language one at a time. They think beyond named languages. Actually, let me just, yes. They think beyond named languages. This is a very important sense of the notion of translanguaging, transcending the artificial boundaries of named languages. To me, it is really inconceivable that when a bilingual person is engaged in producing utterances such as these on the slide, they are switching between different frames of mind or ways of thinking that are determined by the named languages. There is plenty of scientific literature to show that human cognition or thinking is independent of named languages, and bilinguals and multilinguals in particular are very good at thinking beyond named languages. I know this is still a very controversial point, especially for colleagues who are working in intercultural communication or in language and cognition. They may well disagree, but lots of the so-called cognitive advantages of bilingualism are due to the very fact that the bilinguals are capable of distancing objects or concepts from the linguistic labels in phonological forms that may have been given to describe the objects or concepts in different communities. It seems to be a potentially very useful benefit of a translanguaging pedagogy to enhance bilingual learners' distancing capacities by encouraging them to think beyond named languages. Having said all of that, it's very crucial to repeat that when we say that named languages are a byproduct of ongoing languaging activities, and that bilinguals do not think unilingually, we do not say or mean, and I repeat, do not say or mean, that named languages don't exist, nor that bilinguals and multilinguals are not aware of the differences between named languages. It's gotten to a point where it's not just a bit annoying, but actually really rather embarrassing, I think, that some people still put up such straw man argument that somehow some of us said, that named languages didn't exist. Translanguaging scholars have never said that. In fact, my reading of Marconi and Pennycook's work is that they don't say that either. Yeah. What we're saying is that named languages exist is a truism to me. What we are saying is named languages are political constructs, and the naming of sets of linguistic features as language or a dialect or sometimes something else has serious social, political, and of course educational consequences. Wars have been fought over, and blood has been shed over the naming and categorization of languages, dialects, and the rest of it. Bilinguals and multilinguals are absolutely aware of the socially constructed differences between named languages because the development of language awareness is an integral part of one's socialization experience. It is a crucial part of bilinguals' socio-linguistic sensitivities. Translanguaging as a pedagogy can in fact help to maximize the bilingual learners' learning potential by making good use of their awareness and knowledge of different named languages and their socio-linguistic and social-political sensitivities, or critical language awareness, as some people call it. To use translanguaging as a pedagogical practice for inclusion and social justice requires a different mindset on behalf of the teacher and a different narrative from the researchers. And this is the main part I want to focus on. I'm sorry, this is a rather long lead-in, but I think that was necessary. For me, the different mindset is best captured through the notion of co-learning. I first wrote about co-learning in 2013 in the context of heritage language education in complementary schools in the UK, which is my main research focus in bilingual education. And it was very much inspired by Edward Brandmeier's work. The concept of co-learning came not from education, but from other disciplines ranging from artificial intelligence and computer simulation to global security systems and business information management. In essence, co-learning is a process in which several agents simultaneously try to adapt to one another's behavior so that to produce desirable global outcomes that would be shared by the contributing agents. In the classroom context, co-learning changes the role sets of teachers and learners from what Brandmeier calls dispensers and receptacles of knowledge to joint sojourners on the quest of knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. In particular, the teacher would become a learner facilitator, a scaffolder, and critical reflection enhancer, while the learner becomes an empowered explorer, a meaning maker, and a responsible knowledge constructor. Okay, lots of terms there, and let me expand a little. These are Brandmeier's terms rather than mine, by the way. In Brandmeier's words, a facilitator guides the process of students' learning and does not get in the way of learning by imposing information. A scaffolder assesses learners' knowledge and builds scaffolding to extend that knowledge to a broader and deeper understanding. And a critical reflection enhancer asks the learner to reflect on what is being learned and the process of learning. At the same time, an empowered explorer is an independent or collective explorer of knowledge. And a meaning maker and responsible knowledge constructor is one who engages in meaningful knowledge construction that promotes relevancy to their own life. In co-learning, mutual adaptation of behavior is the key. In order to achieve desirable learning outcomes, all co-contributors or participants need to constantly monitor and adapt their actions and learn from each other. Brandmeier was writing about and to those of us in the teaching profession. It's important, very important, to emphasize that co-learning and in the classroom does not simply involve the teacher in developing strategies to allow equitable participation for all. Co-learning requires much unlearning of cultural conditioning because, as Brandmeier points out, it challenges the traditional authoritative, dominant and subordinate role sets in schooling environments and the unequal power relations in wider spheres of our world. And it aims to build genuine community of practice by overcoming the teacher and the learner dichotomy or divide, moving towards a more dynamic and participatory engagement in knowledge construction. According to Brandmeier, the characteristics of co-learning relationship includes all knowledge is valued, reciprocal value of a knowledge sharer, care for each other as people and co-learners, trust and learning from one another. And the characteristics of a co-learning classroom environment includes shared power amongst co-learners, social and individualized learning, collective and individual meaning-making and identity exploration, community practice with situated learning, and real-world engagement and action. Translanguaging and co-learning share a great deal in common. A great deal of common values. In particular, both translanguaging and co-learning emphasize that all knowledge acquired through all languages and in all cultural contexts should be valued. For instance, refugee children have acquired knowledge through languages other than English before they ended up in the UK and entered into the school and classroom systems in this country, just like children from other socially disadvantaged backgrounds will have acquired knowledge in their own communities through what are classified as non-standard English. In an inclusive classroom, co-learning is to show reciprocal value of knowledge sharers who care for each other as people and as co-learners. Their mutual trust is essential in order to learn from each other. In what he describes as pedagogy of vulnerability, Brandmeier urges the instructor to open themselves up and contextualizing that self or selves in social constructs and systems. For him, co-learning entails admitting one does not know everything and be human. It also entails taking risks. Risks of self-disclosure, of change, of not knowing, of failing. What translanguaging focuses on, while translanguaging focuses on valuing all languages and promote the learning of each other's languages and perspectives on the world, co-learning advocates valuing the knowledge, values, and insights of all involved. Both advocate creating opportunities of different ways of learning and different ways of talking about learning, and both point to the need to unlearn cultural conditioning and to dismantle asymmetrical power relations. I'm sure everybody present here know that in today's world, it is common for language classes to have learners from very different linguistic, cultural, and educational backgrounds, some having very complex migration and language learning experiences. They bring with them funds of knowledge, the historically accumulated and culturally developed bodies of knowledge and skills essential for households and individuals' functioning and well-being. Such funds of knowledge contain rich cultural and cognitive resources that can be used in the classroom in order to provide culturally responsive, meaningful, and effective teaching. Teachers, as well as the learners, have much to gain from using these funds of knowledge in the classroom as co-learners, not only to make the classroom more inclusive, but also to engage in real-world meaning making and identity exploration, which are crucial yet often neglected aspects of learning. So let me revisit some of the practical questions or concerns from practitioners that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. One of the most frequently asked questions in teacher training sessions is students have different home languages that I, as a teacher, do not know. How do I manage? And to keep it very practical, the answer may be, ask yourself the question, do they know the concept or method or fact or reasoning that you are trying to teach in their L1s already? If yes, do they think that what they know is different from what the textbook or you as the teacher telling them? But more broadly, it is useful to remind ourselves that education and learning is not about language alone, any language, even in a language classroom. It's about understanding how knowledge is constructed through a particular language, which in itself is a value system. When we argue that named languages are political construct, it has real implications. And the crucial part of an inclusive education for social justice is to learn to respect one another's values, our partners, co-learners' values and perspectives. So here I'm reframing the question, not by devaluing the fact that there are practical challenges in managing a linguistically and socially diverse class, but finding a different frame of thinking about it, a different mindset. Another very practical question, I need to maximize input of the target language, especially in the language classroom, within a fixed and limited period of time. Therefore, I can't possibly allow too many different languages. But we have to remember that real learning, especially of languages, requires application or use in context. And that's one of the key differences, I guess, between language learning and learning of other subject matters. Language learning requires a great deal more actual use in life. Classroom learning is by definition limited and superficial. The monolingual approach to language learning has proven to be ineffective. Plurilingual approaches to language learning maximizes learners' potential, as Ken Williams and many other scholars have argued. Once again, we need a different framing. For instance, when people ask for evidence of the effectiveness of a translanguaging pedagogy, they first of all take translanguaging pedagogy as simply allowing the pupils to use bits of their L1 in class. And they're focusing exclusively on abstract knowledge of linguistic structures or vocabulary size. The evaluation frameworks do not take into consideration of inclusion or social justice at all, or in any meaningful way. They certainly show no interest in understanding the pupils' lived experiences or in bringing the social and sociolinguistic realities of the community into the classroom, into learning and into assessment. And as I said earlier, lots of the translingual expressions that multilingual learners produce are often dismissed as learner errors rather than innovation or creativity. There are long-term consequences of putting down learners' L1s, especially the L1s of minoritized and racialized learners. Social attitudes with different languages and by association towards social groups who speak different languages. Register loss in certain languages, and the inhibition and suppression of their first language can impact on cognitive processing of and emotions towards different languages, which is a topic that hasn't been studied in detail at all. That said, it's very important to emphasize that translanguaging is not patronizingly allowing the learners to use bits of their native language in class. We have said it repeatedly that translanguaging is not additive, but reconstitutive. As a political stance, translanguaging aims to be reconstitutive of language status, of language ideologies, and of authorities and power relations in learning. Consequently, the effects of adopting a translanguaging stance cannot and should not be measured in terms of conventionalized test results. Learners, as well as the teachers' experiences are crucial. A different framing is therefore needed with inclusion and social justice at its very heart. So I'm going to start concluding this talk with another story. I'm sorry, it's going to be a rather long story. And it's one that is about how a teacher transformed her pedagogical practice through co-learning and through translanguaging by supporting a student whom I will call Song. Song is a secondary school boy born in London of Chinese parents whose first language is Shanghainese. But the parents learned Mandarin through schooling in China, and because they studied, worked, and lived in Guangzhou, a Cantonese-speaking city, they know Cantonese too. And they can operate in all these varieties of Chinese and, of course, English. Song grew up speaking mostly Shanghainese with his parents, but English was always in the background and used in the family as well. He attends a Chinese school on weekends where he learned basic Chinese literacy And then he became interested in Chinese calligraphy and has continued to develop this talent as a young artist, and he incorporates that into the modern art he produces. Although Song considers English to be his first language, or one of his first languages, the weekday schools he attends labels him EAL, English as an additional language learner. In fact, he was initially asked to attend EAL lessons in addition to the normal classes at school. And he says he found these EAL lessons extremely boring. In fact, the word he used was stupid. He thought the EAL classes for him was stupid. For the school personnel, it was quite simple. Song is a Chinese kid and his language is Chinese. The school does not understand the complexity of Song's language practices. The picture is there just for Stroop effect. A school does teach Mandarin alongside other modern foreign languages in the curriculum and assume that Song knew Mandarin, whereas in fact his Chinese is Shanghainese at home. When his teacher learned about translanguaging, and this is the interesting part, they started asking him to use Mandarin, the Chinese the school teaches on occasions, even though Song is hardly capable of this because his Chinese is primarily Shanghainese from his parents. So although Song himself feels more British than Chinese, he continues to be seen and categorized as simply as Chinese, with the wrong language variety attached to him. He has been forced into language and ethnic categories that do not reflect the complexities and lived experiences of himself. In isolating these categories as one named language or another, one racial ethnic classification or another, and indeed one gender or another, the complexity of how pupils like Song lead their lives is simply ignored. This means that they always fall out of the school's understandings for inclusion. Only a Mandarin Chinese class is available for Song in his school in London, and he is technically included in that, but it's not quite his Chinese. The minoritized language is also curricularized in ways that do not fit the students' complex multilingual practices. And their race, ethnicity is also biologized in ways that do not allow them more complex ethnic and racial and ethnic and national identifications. It's important to recognize that a first step in all efforts to support students like Song is precisely to recognize their multilingualism, their named languages. It's important for educators to understand that Song's language practices include Mandarin, but also Shanghainese, Cantonese, and of course English. This would go a long way towards resisting the monolingual ethos of schools. But taking the step towards acknowledging the named languages with which racialized students identify is simply not enough, because it leaves intact the monoglossic ideologies about language that nation states and their schools support. To include and support the growing number of racialized bilingual students like Song, much more must occur than simply acknowledging multiple named languages. It's imperative that we focus on the bilingual students' unitary repertoire, their translanguaging. Multilingual awareness is important, but it must be critical. It is essential to acknowledge how these named languages are important for identity and social purposes, but it is also important and more important to understand that reifying them as separate entities will always leave out bilingual learners whose lives are led in the borderlands, that are neither one world or the other. Now I want to say more about the journey that one of Song's teachers has taken, because it illustrates my point really well. As it happens, Song's English teacher studied with us and heard about translanguaging in professional development opportunities. They have read a few articles and consulted some websites. They're very keen to ensure that the students' multilingual capacities are recognized as a resource. That's, a common discourse out there. But they interpreted translanguaging through a double monolingual or monoglossic ideology that is present in much multilingualism scholarship. Song's English teacher is now keen to value Song's first language. One day they asked him to translate something into Chinese in class, something that Song is not really used to doing. Song gets out a couple of words and hears some of the other ethnic Chinese students in class laugh at him because they thought that he was speaking Shanghainese, even though Song was trying to do his own representation of Mandarin. Another day, the teacher encouraged him to consult a website written in Chinese, although Song is embarrassed that he cannot actually do this successfully. Up till then, Song had tried to hide his bilingualism, but now, under the teacher's limited understanding of translanguaging, he's being forced to use a language that in isolation is not quite his, and about which he feels uneasy. During his 10 years of schooling in Britain, his Chinese had never entered into his formal learning. So he mistrusts this new openness or inclusiveness. He doesn't use these words, of course. Before, he had been made to feel deficient in English, in a language seen as his second or even foreign. But now he's being made to also feel inadequate in what is supposed to be his first language. This limited understanding of translanguaging compounds Song's subjectivity of being inferior, foreign, not British, a non-native speaker of English, and now also of Chinese. Suppose that Song was viewed not from an external socio-political perspective of named languages, racial classification or nationality, but from a lived experience of the pupils like Song himself, from their own identities, use of language, and ability to be creative and critical. What would the teacher see? As the world came to a halt because of COVID-19, Song's teachers witnessed up close illness, death, as well as experienced school and work closure. They gained knowledge about the virus and about the vaccines. But to decide on their own vaccination, they needed more than knowledge. They needed to gain understanding, make sense of it all from their own context and through their own affective and sociocultural meanings. This distinction between knowledge and understanding then figured prominently for the teachers as the schools reopened for in-person teaching. They learned more about the students' family lives during homeschooling. They returned with an understanding that they could not just impart knowledge about languages as if it was the same for everyone. Indeed, they needed to keep an eye in the particularities of each student in how they engaged effectively and through their own socio-cultural context with learning and language. Song's English teacher then understood that they could not simply mold Song into a Chinese national or a British national, but would have to act on what Garcia and colleagues called a translanguaging junto stance. The junto stance refers to a perspective that views their practices, racial, ethnic identities together. Song's teachers started viewing teaching as co-learning because the process of teaching and learning are together. They realized that there would be a lot to learn from viewing Song from his own positioning and not from that of the British state or the school. They started to see what Song was capable of as he emerged as a valid learner. For example, the English teacher started to understand how Chinese calligraphy was not an isolated element in Song's life, but its existence in Song's own universe, light years away from the cultural context in which it emerged, in the school especially. As a result, the teacher does not now put Song on the spot to demonstrate his Chineseness. Instead, they begin to see him as another British student who assembles pieces of his life, culture, and knowledge in a creative whole. Song is now given opportunities to demonstrate his understandings, not always in English, not even at times in Chinese, but in the complex ways in which their understandings emerge. Sometimes in the more traditional school modes, like writing, for example, but other times through modes of his choosing: painting, drawing, making collage, photographing, etc. The learning is now in Song's own hands, body, affect, and life, in his own particularity. His teacher merely facilitates his personal translanguaging journey. Song's teacher has understood that they must act with translanguaging shifts as they follow the imagination, creativity, criticality, and complex lives and ways of languaging of the multilingual students in the classroom. Song's teacher also realized that they have to design instruction as to support their multilingual students' translanguaging by turning the classroom into a translanguaging space or spaces. And for them, the purpose of pedagogical translanguaging are to scaffold instruction, to understand what students really know and can do, and to transform subjectivities of inferiority. And the purpose of creating a translanguaging transformative space is to ensure that all students' languaging lives are included in school and to transform the ways they view each other's languaging practices and experiences. Song's teacher's journey is a journey of I was a bit slow with the PowerPoint. Song's teacher's journey is a journey of transpositioning, a process where participants break from their preset and prescribed roles and switch perspectives with each other. Through communicative practices such as translanguaging and transmodalities, and through co-learning, by releasing oneself from conventions and fostering a greater sense of possibility, freeing oneself from habitual thinking and building empathy for each other involved in the process. Or in Maggie Hawkins' words, the multiple and interwoven layers of emplacements and positioning that are entailed in communications which cross and transcend the boundaries that have historically shaped our thinking about the world and its inhabitants. Maggie is here in the audience, and Maggie and I are doing some further work together on the concept of transpositioning, so watch this space. So really, to conclude now, the idea of translanguaging originated as an agentive learner strategy. For translanguaging to be a pedagogy for inclusion and social justice, and indeed innovation, all learners must be trusted in their ability to language and to do it in ways that are theirs and not that of others. They must be understood as themselves according to their own particularities and knowledge systems. Language, race, and gender cannot continue to erect walls that create differences and end up mattering in education. Opening up translanguaging spaces where all learners, whatever language or dialect they may speak, can use their linguistic and semiotic repertoire freely and flexibly and question and challenge the standard unnamed language ideologies is the practical way forward. The creativity and criticality of the learners must be allowed to flow as they construct their own understandings with their own languaging. Only then will all of us have an opportunity to benefit from an ecology of knowledges that thinks beyond the abyssal line and reveals the potential of translanguaging in language, bilingualism, and education. Thank you very much.
Time for questions. Please come up and take your cue here. And for those of you who are on the balcony, please.
Thank you, Li Wei.
Hi, Jim.
Thank you so much. I mean, trying to define translanguaging is obviously a very difficult thing to do, so I really appreciate the clarity that you've provided here in this talk today with such illustrative examples. I really appreciated as well you raising the point about how linguists, in their defining and labeling of language, leads to social injustices. I was wondering around the topic of pedagogical translanguaging, and thank you for raising that title from Cambridge Elements Language Teaching Series. That title is free to download. It's open access from the Cambridge Elements Language Teaching website. But I'm interested in handling that particular title. There was a lot of contention around defining pedagogical translanguaging, two very different camps. And I think the problem really was related to social injustices around what it was that pedagogical translanguaging intended to do. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Okay, thank you for raising that. Obviously, that's in some sense that's the core of my talk today. There are two things I want to say on top of what I've said just now. I think, there is a bit of science about the consequence of naming anything. Once we've named something, people think it's actually it exists as an entity, and I think that's part of the problem of having the term translanguaging, because it's actually a common practice that all human beings have engaged for thousands of years. It's actually quite common, and that's one of the arguments we want to make. Just want to highlight some of the aspects of that practice, but nothing terribly special or different. But of course, having invented that term, people think, oh, there is this thing called translanguaging, which must be different from some other practices, but it isn't necessarily that. And that applies also to pedagogical translanguaging. So people would think, oh, there must be a specific set of things you do in the classroom to make that a pedagogical translanguaging practice. Well, there isn't. And that's what I'm trying to say. To make the idea of pedagogical translanguaging work, or to make translanguaging work as a pedagogy, you actually need to really follow some other ideas like co-learning. So the mindset will have to be different. It doesn't really matter about the specific strategies in the classroom as such. I think the key there is to put inclusion and social justice at the heart of your classroom practice. That's all we are asking to do to adopt a translanguaging stance, to really take that seriously rather than just focusing too narrowly on skills or abstract knowledge or knowledge of abstract things and assess them in that kind of way. So it's a different framing, a different way of thinking about what pedagogy is for. Yeah.
Hey, I want to say thank you. So I thought the talk was really clarified a lot of things about a topic that I didn't fully understand, even though I have tried. I wanted to ask about resistance to translanguaging in classrooms, because when I've taught, for example, when I was teaching in Beijing, lots of students were really resistant to kind of things like using Chinese names for food, and they'd always call it or they'd say it's a pancake with fried stuff in it instead of saying jianbing. And when I was talking to kind of other English speakers living in China, we would always use the Chinese name for it, but I think there was often a lot of resistance to that.
Yeah.
So I just kind of wanted to know what your perspective on kind of encouraging translanguaging in the classroom when the students kind of think, oh, that's not what I'm here to do, or that's not what I want to do, because obviously you want to respect their perspective and you don't want to force anything on them, but at the same time you do kind of want to encourage it. Well.
Thank you very much. I mean, again, it's a kind of commonly occurring theme or question, especially with foreign language education. Lots of people really want to use translanguaging as a way of teaching in modern foreign language classrooms. I mean, there are so many things I can say about it. Translanguaging was never meant for that kind of context in any case. But I guess what I really want to stress is, if we focus purely on learning the language, learning the structure, this is not the way to do it. Translanguaging isn't about that. It's actually questioning the whole point of focusing exclusively on learning structures, and it has a different conceptualization of what language is. Language is a meaning-making potential, and linguistic structures is just one way of making meaning, but there are lots of other ways of making meaning. So I think in China I do understand, and there's a very negative attitude towards certain practices that teachers label as translanguaging. This is essentially wanting them to use a bit of Chinese in class. That is not really what we mean by translanguaging in any case. But I also feel that we should question the whole ideology of monolingual approach to language teaching anyway. Where is real learning happening? Is it they may not be producing or using any Chinese in class, but they may well be thinking in Chinese. We don't know. The learning actually may well be happening multilingually. So, lots of complex issues that need to be dealt with way beyond the classroom. Okay, food is ready. And
there is one more and maybe last question.
Sure.
Hi, I'm from Mauritius, which is multilingual given the colonial legacy that we have. And we've been talking and discussing, I'm a language educator, so we've been talking and discussing about translanguaging as a pedagogy. But we have a very strong examination-oriented system where students go through exam. So how do you locate or situate translanguaging as a pedagogy when teachers are under constraints of the exams, basically?
Yeah, thank you for raising that. I mean, obviously, as I said, if you really want to take the political stance of translanguaging, you really have to reevaluate, change the mindset, reframe the whole thing, and the whole system needs to be revisited, especially the assessment regime. It is not at all true that you can't do it through a translanguaging perspective. You can absolutely do it. There are many practical ways. Dynamic assessment is one that lots of people follow. And we know in Israel there are people who are absolutely, following the principles of translanguaging in language assessment, allowing students to respond to exam questions in whatever, either Arabic or Hebrew, whatever language, or English, in fact, whatever language they feel more comfortable with, and a mixture of that. And you are then evaluating it with very different criteria. It can be practically done. There's no question about that. When it's not done, it is ideological, political, and nothing more than that. So I think unless we change and we challenge and change the political framing and the ideological mindset, we can't really change the testing regime or any practical things. So we need to really take that, as a different issue. Yeah. But thank you for raising it.
So thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you. Thank you. So